If you're one of the people out there who's really trying to keep up with what's going on in the world, all the big changes happening, especially if you've got the UPSC exams coming up, Afghanistan is definitely a place you need to be paying attention to. I mean, it's been a wild ride over there since the U.S. pulled out, and the Taliban is back in charge.
Yeah, no doubt about it. The U.S. leaving and then the Taliban just sweeping right back in like
Right.
that. It's really got people all over the world talking, especially about what everyone should do now. How do you deal with a situation like that?
Well, and that's exactly why we're diving into all this today. We've been taking a good look at the analyses out there, especially what the Hindu's been saying, trying to see if there are any, parallels between what America did in Afghanistan before and what's happening now. But the thing that's really important for anyone prepping for the UPSC, we're going deep on how India is changing its whole approach to the Taliban.
That's the core of it, right? We want to make sure you've got a really solid understanding of all the moving parts in this situation. It's not enough to just know the timeline of events. You've got to get the deeper stuff, like the strategic maneuvering, the geopolitical currents, all that, and especially how those things are shaping the decisions India is making about its foreign policy. This is the kind of nuanced insight that could really make a difference in the UPSC.
All right, so let's kick things off by looking at the U.S. I mean, there's no way to understand what's going on in Afghanistan today without considering what both the Trump and Biden administrations did, right?
It's really interesting how you have these two presidents, with totally different ideas about how to run things overall. But when it comes to Afghanistan, their actions basically end up creating the situation we have now. Like with President Trump, he went and negotiated that deal with the Taliban, the Doha Accords back in 2020. That was a huge turning point.
Right, the Doha Accords.
Mhm.
And the Hindu made a really good point about how that agreement basically pushed the elected Afghan government right out of the picture. It was like the U.S. went straight to the Taliban and cut a deal, didn't even really involve the folks who were supposed to be running the country. And you know what? Thinking about it now, it really feels like that's what opened the door for the Taliban to come storming back in.
The big problem with the Doha Accords, if you ask me, is that they were so focused on getting the U.S. out of Afghanistan on a certain timeline. It was all about the withdrawal date. And they kind of forgot about the bigger picture, making sure there was a stable government, a government that included everyone, a government that could actually keep the peace. It was like they gambled on the Taliban being the answer, and, well, it didn't work out so well. There were so many things missing from that agreement, like nothing about protecting women and minorities and no real guarantees that the Taliban wouldn't just go back to supporting terrorists.
And then in 2021, everything just kind of fell apart, right? It felt like the Afghan Republic went from standing to collapsing almost overnight, and suddenly the Taliban's back in charge.
The speed of that collapse, it was really something else. And you talk to a lot of Afghans, especially ones who had to leave the country, and they see the U.S. withdrawal as a total betrayal, like they were abandoned. A lot of them feel like the country is actually worse off now under the Taliban than it was before.
It's heartbreaking to hear that perspective, but it's so important to understand how they feel. And since the Taliban took over, they've been enforcing these incredibly strict laws, right? It's like they're rolling back all the progress that was made over the last 20 years, especially when it comes to women's rights.
Absolutely. Women are being blocked from getting an education. They can barely participate in public life anymore. It's like their basic freedoms are being shipped away. It's no wonder there's so much concern, both inside Afghanistan and all around the world.
So how has the world reacted to this? It seems like there's a real mix of responses.
It's not a unified front at all. You got the U.S. and a lot of European countries who are pretty much keeping their distance. They're not really engaging with the Taliban. But then you've got other countries in the region like Russia, China, Pakistan, some of the Central Asian nations. They're all engaging with the Taliban to different degrees, each one with their own strategic goals in mind. It's a pretty complex situation.
Now, let's talk about India. It seems like their initial response was to distance themselves from the Taliban, right? I mean, closing the embassy in Kabul back in 2021, that was a big statement.
Yeah, that was a clear sign that India was taking a very cautious approach. And, it makes sense when you think about it. India had always been a strong supporter of the Afghan governments that came before, the democratic ones. And they've opposed the Taliban for a long time, based on their ideology and what they've done in the past. Closing the embassy, that was India's way of saying, we're not on board with this.
But things have shifted since then, haven't they? There are reports that India's reopened a technical mission in Kabul and that they're engaging with Taliban leaders on an official level. That seems like a pretty significant change in policy.
Oh, it definitely is. Reopening that mission and having these direct diplomatic talks, it shows that India is rethinking its whole approach to Afghanistan. There are even hints that they might expand their presence in Kabul, and some talk about them possibly accepting an ambassador from the Taliban in New Delhi.
So what's behind this shift? What's driving this change in India's stance?
Well, from what we're seeing and what analysts are saying, it looks like India is being driven by pragmatism and what's called realpolitik. They're basically acknowledging that the Taliban is the one in control in Afghanistan right now, and they're saying, okay, we need to engage with them to protect our interests.
So what are the arguments in favor of this engagement? Why do some people think it's a good idea?
The people who support engagement, they're pointing to the reality on the ground. The Taliban's in charge. That's just a fact. And they say that India needs to be involved to maintain some level of influence in Afghanistan and keep its own security and strategic goals on track. They also talk about the importance of having these diplomatic channels open so India can provide humanitarian aid and continue those development projects they've been working on. The projects that actually help the Afghan people directly.
But the Hindu also points out that not everyone's buying into these justifications. There are some pretty big doubts about this whole engagement strategy. What are some of the concerns people are raising?
Yeah, there are some serious concerns out there. One of the biggest ones is about whether the Taliban can even hold things together. There are a lot of questions about their internal stability.
You're talking about those reports of internal divisions within the Taliban, right?
Yep. Exactly. Like the tensions between the Haqqani network and the Kandahari clerics, those are serious. They reportedly have completely different views on some really important issues, like whether girls should be allowed to go to school and even the whole direction the government should be taking. And then there are those reports that some of the more moderate Taliban figures have actually fled the country. That could mean there are some really deep cracks within the organization, like it's on the verge of breaking apart.
And if the Taliban is that unstable internally, it makes you wonder how long they can really stay in power, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And then you add in the economic mess in Afghanistan. It's a really tough situation. They lost a lot of foreign aid when the Taliban took over, and their relationship with Pakistan is strained. It all adds up to a very uncertain future. It's way too early to assume that the Taliban's grip on power is secure. There are just too many internal and external pressures they're facing.
Okay, let's go back to this idea of strategic influence for a second. The Hindus' analysis makes a counterpoint to this idea that India's only option for maintaining influence is to work with the Taliban. What's their take on it?
They're basically saying that this whole argument about India needing to engage with the Taliban to have any strategic influence is questionable. They point out that India used to have really strong security and intelligence ties with the Afghan Republic, the government that came before the Taliban, and that was a much more reliable way to protect India's interests in the region. It was a more solid and consistent partnership.
And then there's the whole historical context, right? The Taliban doesn't exactly have a great track record when it comes to its relationship with India.
Yeah, that's a big issue. The Taliban has shown a lot of hostility towards India in the past. There were actual attacks on Indian diplomatic buildings and people in Afghanistan. So expecting them to suddenly do a complete 180 and become friendly with India, that's a huge risk, especially considering their deeply ingrained ideology. It's not likely to change overnight.
It's not just about strategy and politics, though. We also have to consider the Afghan people themselves. The Hindus' analysis raises a really important point about how all this could end up damaging the goodwill that India has built up over the years.
That's a major potential downside. India has always been seen in a positive light by a lot of Afghan people, but now there are these reports that India is refusing to grant visas to Afghans who are trying to escape the Taliban. And that includes Afghans who work directly with Indian institutions, people who help build those strong ties between the two countries. It's causing a lot of resentment, and rightfully so. To exclude those people who are allies to India, it really undermines India's long-term influence and reputation in Afghan society. It sends the wrong message.
So taking all of this into account, the complexities, the potential risks, what would a more balanced approach for India look like? What's the way forward?
Well, the Hindu suggests a few key things. First, they say India should use whatever leverage it has to really push for the rights of all Afghan citizens, especially women and minorities. They should create opportunities for those voices to be heard. A good example would be to support initiatives like the Afghan women's cricket team, giving them a platform, or other projects, cultural or professional, that empower Afghan women and give them a voice.
Right, so staying connected to the broader Afghan society, showing them that India supports their fundamental rights, that's crucial. What else?
The second thing is, instead of just focusing on the Taliban, India could also deepen its ties with the Afghan diaspora, the Afghan communities living outside the country. And with all those different opposition groups that represent a wider range of Afghan political views, like maybe India could host conferences and discussions, give these alternative voices a platform to be heard. That way it's not just the Taliban's perspective that's being considered.
And when it comes to dealing directly with the Taliban, what would a more cautious approach look like? How can India be smart about that?
Well, if engaging with the Taliban is something India feels it has to do for practical reasons, then they need to be really careful. They need to set some firm boundaries, some red lines they won't cross. And with any humanitarian aid or development projects, India needs to make sure that help is actually reaching the Afghan people. They can't let the Taliban use that aid for their own propaganda or to strengthen their grip on power while the people suffer. That would just backfire on India.
So let's sum this all up. We've seen some major changes in U.S. policy toward Afghanistan. It all led to their withdrawal and the Taliban coming back into power. And now India, after initially trying to keep its distance, is having to adapt to this new reality and figure out its own strategy. Exactly. It's a really challenging situation for India. There are possibilities for engagement, but there are also a lot of risks. They have to be pragmatic and deal with the Taliban as the current power in Afghanistan. But at the same time, they can't forget about the Afghan people, their needs and aspirations. And they have to think about the long game, how all of this will affect India's standing in the region in the years to come. It's about finding that balance.
And that brings us to a really crucial point for you, our listener, especially if you're gearing up for the UPSC exams. Understanding these complex global dynamics, this is essential stuff. So here's the big question. How can India navigate this tricky situation? How can they balance their strategic needs with their values, their long-standing commitment to the Afghan people? And what are the ethical considerations here? India wants to be a major player on the world stage, but how do you do that while engaging with a regime like the Taliban, a regime that doesn't have the support of its people and that's suppressing basic human rights? It's a tough dilemma.
These are the kinds of questions you really need to grapple with. You've got to examine these issues from all sides, think about the long-term consequences of different policy choices. That's what the UPSC is all about.
We hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights and gotten you thinking about this important issue. We encourage you to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts and questions in the comments below. And remember, all the analysis we've discussed today is based on reporting and analysis from The Hindu.